There is something sinister about the coastline of the British Isles, which stretches for some 7,000 miles. It's home to grand hotels and picturesque promenades. On the surface, there are bright lights and funfairs, sandy beaches and beautiful sunsets. But dig a little deeper in the sand and you uncover an underworld of murder and mayhem. In Coastal Killers, we take a journey to the cliff's edge, where the land meets the sea and life meets death. A shoreline that is awash with tales of death and depravity. These are the chilling true stories of Britain's worst coastal killers. In this episode of Coastal Killers, we return to perhaps the most famous British seaside town of all, Blackpool. For over a century, its breezy promenade, its funfairs and its piers have attracted holidaymakers from all over the country. But darkness lies there too, and in the darkness was hiding a killer. His name, Michael Downes, and he preyed on the elderly and vulnerable residents of the town.
Michael Downes, if you ask people who knew him, they'll speak about this chap who was helpful, good-humoured, kindness itself, would do anything for anybody. The people you can't speak to are the people who died, who didn't survive meeting him.
Downes was born in Blackpool, the son of a butcher. An unhappy, not very clever, dishonest child was how his teachers described him.
Michael Downes was born on New Year's Eve 1944, so he was a war baby. And he grew up in a respectable family. He went to local schools, but he wasn't, according to his teachers, a good pupil. And by the age of 11, he'd clocked up the first of what would become a lifetime of convictions for burglary and for arson. And he was sent to approved school, which is like a sort of juvenile prison, combining a bit of education with a bit of prison regime.
This is an extremely antisocial sort of start to his life. He's already doesn't seem to be able to kind of keep on any straight and narrow path, but is constantly getting into trouble and committing all sorts of crimes.
And like many young men who were born just before the end of the Second World War, he joined the army.
He has to do national service, but he doesn't stay very long. Very shortly after he's conscripted into the armed forces, he goes AWOL, he deserts. And he goes back to Blackpool, to the area he knows best, to South Shore. And he would probably have been able to hide out there, to live there unnoticed. This is an area with a high transient population, a lot of visitors. He would probably have escaped notice had it not been for an act of heroism that he carried out.
In 1962, in an act of extraordinary courage, he saved a man, or tried to save a man, who was drowning 50 yards off the beach in Blackpool. His name was James Tweedale.
The young Michael Downes got Tweedale to the shore, and momentarily, Downes became a hero.
Downes jumped in, swam 50 yards out to sea, and dragged him back to the shore. Now, unfortunately, the elderly man died on his way to hospital, but it was still a remarkably brave thing for a young man to do. So brave, in fact, that he was awarded the British Empire Medal for Gallantry, the youngest person ever to receive that. The fact that he did this when he was AWOL from his regiment kind of got pushed to one side, but it did ensure that he got taken back to his regiment.
On the surface, it looked like the start of a glittering career. Tragically, sadly, it was not to prove the case.
2 years later, Michael Downes was to murder a Libyan taxi driver.
There are very few records relating to this, but in 1965, Downes was charged and convicted with killing a taxi driver in Libya. He stabbed him to death. We don't know why, we don't know what prompted it, we just know that he was convicted of manslaughter.
He was stripped of his British Empire Medal and was imprisoned for 12 months.
What I find horrifying is he only got 12 months in the glass house for that. So it wasn't seemed to be a very highly regarded offence, where normally manslaughter would have got a double-figure sentence or a life sentence.
He was dishonourably discharged. Downes struggled. He came back to Blackpool, where he was to meet and to marry his wife Hilda. They met while they were playing snooker together in a pub. For a time, Downes seemed to settle down. The memory of the Libyan killing diminished. But there was something unsettled about him. He drank too much. He went from job to job, mostly driving.
He drove a laundry van and he drove a taxi. This involves his crimes, really, because it gave him an opportunity to get to know some of the people who lived there and to just familiarise himself with the surroundings. So I think his job was very closely connected with some of his crimes, with all of his crimes, really.
Downes is a classic itinerant, but also with an appetite for burglary.
Away from his normal working activities, his burglary side of his life carried on. During the normal course of his work, he was clearly had an eye out for opportunities so that he could return at night. And he was a fairly skilled person at breaking into places, and he had a very keen eye on an opportunity.
His marriage to Hilda breaks down in 1977 when he's given an 18-month sentence for burglary.
While he was in jail, his wife, she'd had an affair with somebody else and was pregnant by another man. So when he came out of jail and she told him this, it was clear that the marriage was over. He was on his own.
Rather than do what a lot of men would have been, to beat up the man or beat up the wife or do something, he seems to have coped with that quite reasonably, which again is in conflict with the image of somebody being violent when they're 18, 19-year-old. He doesn't seem to be violent towards the partner or the wife.
Instead, Downes targeted his anger and frustration about what had happened in a completely different direction, with tragic consequences.
The one way that somebody like that finds a way of exercising some kind of control is by invading somebody else's home, being in control and inflicting violence on them.
On Tuesday, the 31st of January, 1978, an elderly lady called Katherine Weaver, always known as Kitty, was attacked in the Nook Rest Home in Blackpool.
In the early hours of the morning, Downes broke into the care home where Kitty Weaver lived and made his way to her bedroom. He then carried out a brutal and devastating attack on her.
She was aged 64 when she died. She only weighed 6 stone. She had terminal cancer. She was quite independent and quite a proud sort of person. She was quite socially isolated. She's in bed. It's 4:30 in the morning. Somebody comes into her room, grabs her and takes her into the kitchen, ties her up, has some kind of sexual activity, and possibly he rapes her, and then he kills her with a knife. I mean, it's almost unimaginably dreadful.
He ties her up with a piece of washing line. He strips her, he molests her, probably rapes her.
It's clearly a sexual crime, and I would argue that's in response to the relationship breaking up with his wife. That's the trigger. And then sometime later, the opportunity arises and he gives way to this explosive violence.
I think he probably went there to attack somebody because I don't think the pickings at a nursing home are going to be that great. So this was an opportunity for him to vent his anger on a defenseless person.
I think he thought about this attack, probably fantasized about it beforehand. He came prepared. He came prepared to kill.
Kitty was found that morning lying in the kitchen with a 9-inch vegetable knife found near her body.
Why attack an old woman? Well, she's 64, she's physically vulnerable, and yet I don't think that was the reason. I think it was much more the fact that he enjoyed the idea of sex with older women.
There were no clues as to who might have attacked her. It appeared utterly random. She had no enemies, and she certainly wasn't a rich woman. And there was no evidence of burglary.
On the surface, it appeared an utterly random killing, and as such, mystified the local police.
The question was, who could have done such a dreadful thing to an ill and vulnerable woman? On the morning of January 31st, 1978, a shocking discovery was made. The body of 64-year-old Kitty Weaver was found in the kitchen of the rest home where she lived. She'd been murdered and sexually assaulted in a savage attack, the likes of which had never been seen in Blackpool before.
Kitty Weaver was related to a famous rock-making family in Blackpool. She'd married one of the 4 Weaver brothers, responsible for much of the town's rock. Her husband had died, sadly, in 1969, and they'd had no children. As far as the police could discern, she had absolutely no enemies whatever.
The police were uncertain what the motive was for killing Kitty Weaver. What they did was to launch a massive inquiry into her death.
1,500 people interviewed, 1,600 separate statements, 1,700 sets of fingerprints. This is a huge, time-consuming investigation.
I was aware of the Kate Weaver murder, as was everybody in Lancashire sadly aware, because initially it was an unusual type of murder for a start, not what we were used to. There were a lot of doors knocked on during the investigation for Kate Weaver, where people were asked to give fingerprints and, as well as say where they were on the time, the usual thing, asking questions about who they are and whether they lived there, did they see anything, all the usual stuff. And a lot of people gave fingerprints that you wouldn't normally expect.
I personally was fingerprinted and questioned at the time, but I have to say I never felt in any way that I was a suspect. It was just that they fingerprinted and questioned probably every single male for about half a mile around the area of the rest home. I felt quite happy to be helpful. I think everybody I knew was very happy to go along with helping them.
One of the most significant pieces of evidence that was found at the scene of Kitty Weaver's murder was a piece of clothesline.
A piece of washing line from outside the premises where Kate Weaver was residential home. The murderer had actually cut some of the line down and taken it into the premises, and we believe he tied her up with that while he murdered her and possibly sexually assaulted her.
It would be many years before its significance would be truly underlined. As far as the police were concerned, it was a matter of conjecture, speculation, but there was no one at all who could be brought to justice. The police were looking for a ghost.
The police probably didn't get him at that point because there was no strong, powerful forensic evidence. There were no witnesses. He'd been very clever at this point.
The reality was that the killer was very close by. He was living very close to the crime scene, and he had previous form. It's just that the police didn't know.
Downes was hiding in plain sight. You wouldn't immediately see him as being frightening or even potentially a murderer. He seemed too ordinary for that. But then, as we've said so many times, murderers never have horns and a tail and a black cloak. They are more often than not someone you would barely notice in the street.
Everybody had this view that it was so horrendous that we had to find this guy. Every time we got together to talk about crime, this Kate Weaver murder came to light and it was discussed. Went all through it all again about the rope and the knife and everything involved in it. And it was on everyone's mind to try to find this guy. And nothing ever came to light.
More than 2 years passed until on the evening of May the 3rd, 1980, an elderly lady called Hilda Keefe sees a man breaking into her house in Blackpool.
She heard knocking, so she went to the window and there was Michael Downes banging on the window, gesturing for her to let him in. So she thought, well, I'll scare him away, so she shouted, "Dad, Dad." But he didn't take any notice. And he started to open the window with a glass cutter. Now, what Michael Downes probably didn't know was that her mother was still alive.
Her mother yelled out and attracted attention, and that scared the man off. I think Hilda Keefe and her mother probably had a very lucky escape. If that was Downes, and it looks very much like it was, then he went there with the intention of sexually assaulting them and killing them, or at least one of them. The fact that they shouted out, the fact they were able to attract attention, disturbed him. It made him run off, and that's what saved their lives.
Hilda Keefe is able to give the police an absolutely accurate description of the man she has seen trying to break into her house. Now, a local police constable, David Milner, is very interested in this.
When she was having a conversation with PC Dave Milner, she said to him, "It's a shame you haven't caught him yet. He had such a distinctive green jacket." And she said, "Yes, I actually saw the guy nearby the other day." And so PC Milner was then able to actually keep an eye out when he was in the area, and lo and behold, actually spotted a man wearing this distinctive type of green jacket that she'd said the intruder to her home was wearing.
The description that Hilda had given exactly fitted Michael Downes, but she wouldn't take part in an identity parade. She was understandably terrified.
Milner questions Downes, who insists that he doesn't even know where Hilda Keefe lives, even though he lives less than 2 streets away. PC Milner was suspicious of Downs, but there was very little to connect Downs directly to the attempted burglary of Hilda Keefe, and even less to connect Downs to the murder of Kitty Weaver.
Poor Dave had it, you know, he sort of had it on his conscience for years, that he had the guy, but we couldn't prove it.
Michael Downs had killed an Arab taxi driver in Libya. They didn't have access to military records at that time. I think in that bit of crucial evidence, if the police had been aware of that, they would have certainly questioned Michael Downs more seriously. You ask yourself, was this a missed opportunity? A lot depends on how Michael Downs would have reacted under sort of strong interrogation. The only way they could link it was through a confession. And I don't think Michael Downs would have confessed.
For the moment, Michael Downs once again disappeared into the ether of Blackpool.
It was to be 8 years before Downs would return and commit a further crime. In 1978, Michael Downs had murdered an elderly lady, Kitty Weaver. Then, in 1980, seriously assaulted another, Hilda Keefe. But despite being questioned by police, they had no grounds to charge him.
8 years have passed. P.C. Milner may have had his suspicions about Michael Downs, but no officer has knocked on Downs' door to arrest or to charge him. When in January 1988, Downs strikes again. Was it significant? It's almost exactly 10 years since the murder of Kitty Weaver.
And in an echo of his previous attacks, Downs was again experiencing personal trauma in his life, which may have been the trigger.
He'd fallen out with his girlfriend, he'd lost his job, and it's hard to see that that his heavy drinking, his falling out with his girlfriend and his losing his job weren't part of the same phenomenon, really, that he was kind of losing it all round, really, and unable to recover any sense of control over his own life.
Betty Morris was a local character. She used to provide costumes for showgirls. Her proper name was Gabrielle, but she was always known as Betty.
Betty Morris was a strongly independent person. She ran a small boarding house in what they call Little Bispham, which is on the promenade. She was a dressmaker primarily. At that time especially, they used to have lots of shows in Blackpool, and she used to make costumes for these glamorous dancers, and she used to make costumes for pantomimes.
On January the 26th, 1988, Betty Morris is attacked in her guest house. She is stabbed, but worse, she is also mutilated.
When the attack came, she didn't freeze. It seems as though she actually fought back, which is an extraordinary thing for somebody to do, but she had plenty of defensive injuries, so it seems as if she really did try to fight him off.
38 bruises are counted on her body. She's fought, she's put up an intense struggle. But a 70-year-old lady who is retired into herself is no match for a man younger than she is and who was, after all, in the army. What must that poor 70-year-old woman have thought as she lost her life at the hands of Michael Downs? The police were unclear what the motive was for the murder of Gabrielle Betty Morris. It didn't appear to be any kind of burglary or theft. There was the suspicion that there might have been some kind of sexual motive.
Why choose her? Because he obviously had some feelings towards her, both sexual and anger. He didn't just rape her, he actually did really quite horrendous attack on her body. A lot of overkill, which normally if you kill somebody, 2 or 3 stab wounds, and that's it. But when you have 20, 30 stabbings, A, it tells you that it's somebody that's likely to be local, known to her, there is a relationship of some sort. It's overkilling, and you don't need to overkill.
On investigating Betty's background, police discovered a disturbing piece of information. It wasn't the first time Betty had been attacked in her own home.
Betty Morris was something of a loner. She'd had a reputation for some years as being solitary and perhaps slightly suspicious of outsiders. She'd once been popular, but in 1974, something had happened to Betty Morris which turned her life inside out. It made her fearful.
In 1974, Betty Morris was attacked in her home by a man wearing a mask who hit her with a hammer.
It could be that he did intend to kill her for all we know. I mean, he did hit her with a hammer and he did assault her. It could be that he thought he'd killed her or he couldn't follow through the attack.
When detectives investigated, they suspected that she'd actually been raped, but she didn't want to pursue that.
After the attack, she became fearful of strangers. The police found that she had made a series of reports to them about people congregating at the tram stop, which was just across the street from her guest house. She used to watch people with binoculars, and if a man appeared suspicious, she would ring the police and say, "There's a man out there." Now, this was all perfectly understandable. She'd endured a terrible ordeal. She'd survived, against the odds, an attack which could have cost her life in 1974. But it all added up to the picture of someone who, for 14 years, lived her life in fear.
Betty could never identify her attacker. She went in and out of consciousness during the attack, and when she finally came round, he'd gone. I think that was the first proper attack by Michael Downs on an elderly woman in Blackpool. Did Michael Downs decide to return to the scene of his earlier crime, to complete what he failed to do in 1974?
14 years later, he comes back to kill her, and that is a very strange phenomenon. He obviously had fantasized about her for some time, and the fact he's gone back just to complete the cycle, which suggests that the first time he went there, his intentions was to kill her, because he goes back 14 years later to finish off the job.
I think he'd always thought that Betty Morris was a victim and he intended to take her life. It's a horrifying thought, but nevertheless, we are dealing with a most evil and depraved man.
Having been attacked 14 years before, she's really tuned into security and everything else. So that's a high risk for him, but it shows the motivation. Why? Because I think he was angry having had his relationship broken up. He's angry because he's lost his job. She is going to be the victim of his anger.
In my mind, Downs always had a sexual motive. Not necessarily to penetrate his poor, vulnerable, elderly victims, but to prove his sexual power over them. Something in Michael Downs wished to impress himself upon the elderly women of Blackpool.
It's very hard to think what the last moments of her life were like when you think that she'd been spending 14 years reliving and dreading a sort of attack, and then the attack happened again and by the same person. It's almost unthinkable.
Downs, though he may have appeared to the world at large as unworrying, easy to deal with, a bit of a drinker but not anything to worry about, was in fact something quite different and something quite darker. Here is a man who has been left pretty much to do whatever he wanted for a very, very long time. And what's more, he's got away with it. But now, Detective Superintendent Jack Ashton remembered the case of Kitty Weaver and remembered P.C. Milner's suspicions about Downs.
The net closed in around Downs because the police had always been aware of him from his run-in with Dave Milner all those years before. They hadn't forgotten the fact that he was just round the corner, and they'd always had this feeling that he may have been involved in these crimes. They had another compelling bit of evidence this time, which was a thumbprint at Betty Morris's home.
When Betty's corpse is discovered, the detective superintendent seals the scene. An incredibly sensible decision, because at one point a thumbprint is discovered in the house.
That thumbprint led the police to Michael Downs. His thumbprint was in Betty Morris's blood. There is no explanation for that other than he was at the crime scene. Killers, particularly multiple killers, have two things which police look for: a modus operandi and what's called a criminal signature. And put together, what they say is, this is how this man kills, this is what he uses to kill, this is where he kills, and this is why he does it. And that, combined with his known criminal history, pointed to him not just as the prime suspect, but really as the only suspect.
I think Ashton had already decided that Downs was the likely perpetrator of this dreadful crime. But the thumbprint proved it.
When a thumbprint was found at the murder scene of Betty Morris, it was identified as having belonged to Michael Downs. He quickly became the prime suspect and was taken to Blackpool police station. Within hours, he admitted to killing her, but his story didn't end there.
I was a sergeant at Blackpool, and I was there on the day that Michael Downs was arrested and brought into the police station. My involvement in it really was the fact that Michael Downs at one stage asked me if he could speak to the CID that had brought him in. I was unaware of the reason, of course, he wouldn't tell me. He did look as if he wanted to admit to something, you know, like he had that look in him like a child sort of wanting to tell the truth on and tell a lie. I just knew there was something very important. I phoned the superintendent, and they came down and he admitted to a previous murder, which was the Kate Weaver murder.
What connects the two murders 10 years apart is the victims, the style of killing, the sexual element, the overkill in terms of the stabbing and violence towards them. So they do actually mimic each other quite closely.
One of the things that linked the killing of Kitty Weaver and the killing of Betty Morris was a piece of clothesline. Clothesline was found at both scenes.
He would pick this up in the garden of the victim and cut off strips of clothesline, which he would then use to bind the victim once he was inside. And that was a constant.
Michael Downs came to be known as the clothesline killer because of those pieces of clothesline that were discovered alongside the bodies of both Kitty Weaver and Betty Morris. He'd used the clothesline to subdue them and to drag them where he wanted them to be.
He does have a pattern of killing for sure. He's got an MO, for instance, which involved binding his victims with clotheslines, stabbing and assaulting them sexually. And his signature would be what actually happened during his carrying out the crime, which was these assaults. So I think that was what he was in a way fixated on. He wasn't really burgling them to sort of get their money and belongings. He was actually more interested in the assault aspect, and that's where that's where we see the true him. That's what these attacks are really about.
When I heard the killer of Betty Morris was also the killer of Kitty Weaver, I was very shocked because I knew about the two crimes, but I hadn't connected them. And the idea that these two crimes, 10 years apart, had the same perpetrator was really quite a shock to me.
The two victims, I think, were meaningful to him. So they weren't just randoms, they were meaningful for whatever reasons to him. So the gaps are far too long. We haven't got the normal 2 or 3 months killing period, cooling off killing. It's far too long. So I see them as two separate murders and not part of a series. But they share the commonality of the victims, the style of killing, and things like that.
And another thing that's noticeable about the final murder is he wasn't taking any of the precautions that he would take in previous murders. They just found a bloody thumbprint in where the murder took place. I mean, previously he'd taken some steps to conceal his presence. So I have a sense that he was actually falling apart, disintegrating, and that his final murder was almost like a kind of resignation. It was an act of resignation. He had nowhere to go. What could he do?
It's very difficult to fathom why he does admit to murdering Kitty Weaver. Personally, I suspect he may have actually had his conscience pricking him about that. It had probably been in the back of his mind for many years, well, for 10 years. It's certainly been sort of perhaps going around his thoughts. He'd probably walked past the scene of the crime many times. It seems as though he just blurted it out when they brought him in for Betty Morris' attack.
It was vindication for P.C. Milner, who had those suspicions all those years previously. It was also a vindication for Detective Superintendent Ashton, who had actually got the right man.
Downes had been hiding in Blackpool, in the shadows, for more than a decade.
His ex-partner talks about him in quite polite, fond way, but says the problem was the drink. He would lose control with drink and she eventually threw him out. Then we see a connection between being thrown out of the relationship, the house, being made homeless, drinking, and then we see this vicious attack on his victim.
On the surface, he was insignificant. And yet, in reality, he was capable of taking the lives of two elderly women and not blinking an eye when he did it. Believe it or not, Michael Downes did not plead guilty to murder, in spite of his confession. Instead, he pleaded guilty to manslaughter by reason of diminished responsibility.
I think Michael Downes was looking for a form of defence, and I think he decided that his best form of defence was to claim diminished responsibility. And I think it came to his mind that his defence of diminished responsibility would be more effective if he confessed to killing Kitty Weaver.
He claimed he did this essentially while the balance of his mind was disturbed. He claimed it was manslaughter, diminished responsibility. The jury didn't buy that. They convicted him of murder, and the judge sent him to prison for life for both offences.
It took the jury at Manchester Crown Court just 50 minutes to convict Michael Downes of the two murders. In July 1989, Michael Downes was given a life sentence for the two murders of Kitty Weaver and Betty Morris. The recommendation was eventually to be confirmed that he would serve no less than 23 years in prison. He was described by the judge during sentencing as an extremely dangerous man. I think that's an understatement. He was more than dangerous. He was lethal, and particularly to elderly, vulnerable women.
Downes' crimes also sent shockwaves through the community in Blackpool, not just because a local man had been responsible for such a heinous series of crimes, but also that he was potentially Blackpool's first serial killer.
Most murderers in Blackpool are people that have come to Blackpool to hide from the police forces from where they come from. There's an awful lot of people get picked up in Blackpool for crimes elsewhere. It's that sort of place. And although it is a busy seaside resort with a lot of people coming and going, the actual community itself is quite respectful.
Michael Downs fits the profile in some ways of a serial killer. A serial killer is someone who kills 2 or more people, but a serial killer will also carry on killing. A serial killer will kill and kill and kill again until he is caught. What a serial killer won't have is lengthy periods in which he doesn't kill.
What's fascinating is the murders are 10 years apart. He had killed in Libya, he killed these 2 women, but the first one I suspect was an act of just argumented violence, instant violence, while the 2 murders of the women are much more planned and intentional. But again, that gap of 10 years is very unusual for killers to make a gap that long.
That's where Michael Downs doesn't fit the profile of a serial killer. The best the police could come up with as an explanation was that he had a trigger that flicked the switch inside him, and in flicking that switch, it unleashed the man whose pathology was to sexually assault and murder elderly women for sexual pleasure.
He broke up with his wife, and that led to one killing, breaks up with the girlfriend, and that results in another killing. But the killings are quite violent, quite sexual. I mean, he's gone for a 64-year-old woman, he's gone for a 74-year-old woman. These are quite strange in many ways because it's almost indicative of somebody who's interested or sexually attracted to older women. Or was it because they were vulnerable?
It's almost not so much the sexual aspect of it, probably, but it's the power aspect of it. This is one area of his life where he can actually exercise power and be in control. And he's exercising his rage and his longing to have some kind of power trip, basically. I think he emerged from his young years as a very dangerous loner, somebody who had a kind of hatred towards the world because he'd had a troubled upbringing. And he developed these kind of obsessions with burglary and arson when he was quite young. And I think he had this inner monologue where it was a way for him to feel good about himself in a way.
That pathology, what drove him to sexually assault and kill elderly women, is very unlikely to have been dealt with in prison. The likelihood is that he's served his time, he's emerged from prison, been released back into the community with that pathology intact. And that makes him still a very dangerous man.
In the wake of his committal, one detective suggested that Downs had a kink when it came to elderly women. When someone upset him, he got drunk and sought sexual gratification in these senseless killings. And senseless they most certainly were. Both Blackpool and the world were a safer place once Downs was safely behind bars.